I'm an underground maintenance electrician at Black Hollow Mine in McDowell County, not far from Welch, which sounds cleaner when you say it fast than it feels when you're actually standing in it. My job isn't cutting coal. I'm the guy they send when a panel starts lying, when a relay sticks, when backup power doesn't transfer clean, when a sensor decides it's smarter than the man reading it, and when one of the dewatering pumps starts acting like it's got its own opinion. Mines don't stay open because one crew does one hard thing well. They stay open because 100 smaller systems keep doing what they're supposed to do at the exact moment somebody needs them. Most nights I'm somewhere in that chain. Black Hollow had been around long enough to have old habits in the walls. You could feel it in the way the place had grown. Newer runs tied into older sections that had been cut, abandoned, reinforced, bypassed, and then reused when somebody higher up decided there was still something worth pulling out of the ground. Some parts of the mine felt planned. Other parts felt patched. You saw junction boxes mounted over older bolt holes, conduit clipped around supports that didn't match, sections of line that had clearly been put in years apart by men who never met each other. That wasn't unusual underground. It just meant you learned to trust what was in front of you more than what the maps claimed. The problem that week was Lower Sump. More specifically, Pump 2 at Lower Sump Station. For 3 nights running, it had been throwing bad behavior with no clean pattern. Sometimes it kicked on before the level line rose on the panel. Sometimes the panel said the level was climbing, and the pit camera showed nothing but a low, dark sheen at the bottom. Sometimes the camera feed fuzzed over with static so thick it looked like a weathered VHS tape. The radio also liked to get thin in the last stretch of tunnel down there, then come back like nothing had happened. None of those problems by themselves would have made a story. Mines run on wet air, vibration, bad angles, and old equipment hanging on one more season than anyone admits. You get used to ugly readings. You get used to gear acting older than the paperwork says it is. What made it mine that night was simple. The man who usually covered Lower Sump was suddenly out, and Doyle Rigsby needed the shift filled. Doyle was our night foreman, one of those men who looked like he'd been built for clipboards, bad news, and not wasting words. He found me near the maintenance rack while I was checking a spare lamp battery and said, "You're covering Lower Sump tonight." "Jesse said it was throwing bad signals again," I said. Doyle kept looking at the clipboard. "Then treat every signal like it's real." That was the kind of answer Doyle liked. Not a discussion, not reassurance, just a sentence that put the work back in your hands. I wiped my fingers on a rag and took the log sheet from him. Pump 2. Intermittent early start, monitor noise, radio drop in final access stretch, no confirmed flooding, no confirmed mechanical fault. It was the kind of page that could mean nothing or could mean you were about to lose half your night to a problem that only showed itself when nobody was around to witness it twice. "How long am I staying down there?" I asked. Doyle looked past me toward the cage lift. "Till it stays quiet." He said it flat, not dramatic, not joking either. That was the first thing that sat wrong with me. The second was harder to pin down. Nobody else had much to say about Lower Sump, but that wasn't the same as people not noticing it. Men noticed what they avoided. At the coffee station, Jesse Morrow was leaning against the wall with his cup in one hand, saying nothing. 2 roof guys near the lockers went quiet when I picked up the extra radio battery. Nobody gave me a warning. Nobody told me not to go. It was just that same attitude all the way around. Do the work and come back up. I clipped my radio on, checked my lamp, and headed in. The first part of the run was normal enough. Mainline traffic had already thinned, and once I got past the busier section, the mine settled into the usual night shift sound. Fans moving air somewhere you couldn't see, water ticking off rock, the occasional far-off hit of steel on steel. My boots knew the grade before my eyes did. I followed the cable run and the reflected stripe off the damp rib until the main route gave way to the branch that dropped toward Lower Sump. The air changed first. It always did. It got wetter as I went down, not cooler exactly, just heavier, like the mine was breathing closer to my face. The smell shifted with it, wet metal, machine oil, standing water that had sat too long in the dark. My headlamp caught the railings and turned every bead of moisture on them into a white blink that vanished as soon as I moved. Once, halfway down, the radio cracked in my ear with a burst of static so sharp I almost reached up to smack it, then it cleared on its own. I kept walking. The last access stretch narrowed and curved enough that the light from the main line disappeared behind me for good. That was where the place started feeling separate, like it belonged to a different part of the mine, even though it was on the same map. Lower Sump wasn't far, but it always felt farther at night. The tunnel walls there were darker and wetter, and sound carried wrong. Small noises didn't die. They bounced and came back thinner. That was when I heard Pump 2. I hadn't seen the station lights yet. I hadn't reached the outer gate, but I could hear the pump ahead of me, echoing through the narrow tunnel in a steady industrial thud that should have sounded familiar. Instead, it came to me like a mechanical heartbeat with something off in the timing. Not a full miss, not a bad bearing, just a rhythm that felt half a beat ahead of where it belonged. I stopped, pulled the log sheet back into the cone of my lamp, and checked the latest entry one more time. No level rise yet. Pump 2 was already running. I stood there for a second with the log sheet in my hand and the pump thudding somewhere ahead of me, and the first thing I felt wasn't fear. It was irritation. Real fear usually takes a minute to get organized. What hits first, at least for me, is the part of my brain that starts sorting through dumb practical explanations, because that's what I do for a living. Bad sensor. Lag in the level monitor. Somebody logged the time wrong. A sticky relay. Water sloshing in the pit and catching the float late. There are a lot of ways a system can look wrong underground before it turns out to actually be wrong. Maintenance sounded safer on paper when I first moved into it. Less direct risk. Same mine. Same night shift. Same overtime if the hours were there. That was the theory, anyway. What nobody tells you when you move into maintenance is that the dangerous part isn't always where the machine is biggest. Sometimes it's where the people are thinnest. It's the dead stretches between one active area and the next. It's the old branch nobody likes because the radio goes bad there. It's the room with one humming transformer and no reason for anyone else to come by unless something's already gone sideways. Face crews have numbers. They've got noise and movement and witnesses. Guys like me get sent where the system stopped behaving, and everybody else would rather pretend they haven't noticed yet. I folded the log sheet once and slid it under my arm while I pulled my phone from my pocket. No service down there, obviously, but I'd checked it before the cage anyway, same as I always did. That was habit by then. Half practical, half pathetic. I had a text thread open with Micah from earlier that evening. Nothing big, just kid stuff. A picture of a crooked science project volcano on the kitchen table at his mom's place. Then, "You think this looks real enough?" Then another one a minute later because he never waits for an answer before sending the next thought. "Mom said it needs more red." I'd sent back. More red always helps. Then he called for maybe 2 minutes while I was still in the lot, mostly to tell me the cat had knocked over one of his markers and that the blue one had rolled under the couch where nobody could reach it. That was 9-year-old boy emergency scale. End of the world for 10 minutes. Gone by morning. I looked at those messages a second longer than I needed to, then locked the screen and slid the phone away. There's a kind of math you do when you're trying to hold on to a life that's already gotten smaller than you meant for it to. Not big math, not dramatic, just the small mean kind. Hours, fuel, what you can push 2 days past due without getting a late fee that makes it worse. What your truck sounds like now versus what it'll sound like in 3 more months if you keep pretending you don't hear the front end talking. Whether one extra shift gets you back even or only buys you another week before you're behind again. My truck was old enough that the driver's side window had to be persuaded the last 2 inches in cold weather. The power bill on the kitchen counter at home had a red strip on it. I had a payment due on a set of tires I should have replaced all at once, instead of one by one, like a man trying to out-negotiate his own bad luck. And the thing that sat over all of it was Micah. I wasn't living with his mother anymore. That part had been over long enough that nobody around me still treated it like news, which was a relief. There are clean divorces in the world, probably, but ours hadn't been one of them. Nothing explosive by the end. Just years of 2 people getting tired in different directions until the silence in the house felt more permanent than the furniture. What mattered now was simpler and meaner than love. Schedules, weekends, gas money. Whether I looked reliable enough on paper to keep getting the time I had with my son, without somebody deciding I was drifting into the kind of man who starts missing Saturdays and then misses more than that. I wasn't trying to win him back from anything. I was trying to stay in the shape of his life. That sounds bigger than it felt. Most of the time it came down to ordinary things. Picking him up on a Sunday morning, taking him for burgers, letting him talk my ear off about whatever game he was into that month. Listening to him explain rules from something he'd made up in the back seat like they mattered more than gravity. He had this little habit when he was on the phone and excited about something. If I didn't answer fast enough, he'd tap 3 quick knocks against whatever he was holding and then say, "Dad, you there?" He'd started it when he was younger by knocking on my apartment door the same way. 3 fast taps like a signal, only we knew. It stuck. Kids make rituals out of almost nothing. Parents do too if they're smart enough to notice. That was part of why I'd taken the extra nights. Earlier in the shift, before Doyle handed me the log sheet, Jesse had caught me by the supply cage while I was signing out a fresh battery and a spare set of insulated gloves. He had coffee in one hand, and that look on his face he always wore when he knew a little more than he was interested in sharing. "You taking all 3 nights?" Jesse said. "That's the plan," I said. Jesse looked at me for a second. "Must be some plan." He wasn't smiling when he said it. Jesse didn't smile much underground. He just watched people like he was measuring whether they were about to make his life harder. "You could have said no," Jesse said. "Not this month," I said. That was the whole truth without any of the paperwork attached to it. Not this month. Not with Micah's school stuff coming up. Not with my truck coughing every morning. Not with weekends already feeling too short and too easy to lose. Overtime was ugly money, but it spent the same. And saying no to extra shifts was the kind of thing that got remembered when cuts came around, or when somebody higher up started deciding who counted as dependable. So no, I wasn't standing in that tunnel because I was brave. I wasn't there because I liked dark holes in the ground or because I thought I had some special nerve other men didn't. I was there because the pump was running when it shouldn't have been, and because the number of things I could afford to walk away from had gotten smaller than the number of things asking me to stay. I took the extra battery, clipped my radio back into place, and headed for Lower Sump anyway. Before I headed all the way down, Doyle stopped me near the maintenance rack and handed me something folded once down the middle. Not a clipboard, not a work order, just a white card, a little heavier than regular paper, like somebody had run it through a laminator years ago and then trimmed the edges with a dull blade. It had been folded enough times that the crease was starting to whiten. Doyle held the card out to me. "Keep it on you." I looked down at it. "What is this?" "What keeps the night short?" Doyle said. He said it the same way he might have said, "Keep your radio on or don't miss the 11:30 p.m. reading." No drama in it, no grin, no pause to let it sink in. That was part of why I took it, instead of handing it right back. If he tried to sell it, I probably would have pushed. Underground, men mess with each other. New guys get sent after fake faults. Contractors get fed bad directions for the fun of watching them circle back irritated. But jokes usually carry their own scent. Somebody watches your face too closely. Somebody waits for the laugh. Doyle didn't do any of that. He just stood there with the clipboard tucked under one arm, like this was another piece of equipment I was supposed to sign out. I opened the card. There was no heading, no logo, no safety language, no mine name. Just 5 lines of typed instructions, each one spaced cleanly from the next, like somebody had rewritten them enough times to know exactly how much room each one needed. If pump 2 starts running before the panel shows a level rise, do not look into the sump. Shut the outer gate, log the time, and wait exactly 90 seconds. If you hear knocking from inside the discharge pipe, do not answer it, do not tap back, and do not radio for a second confirmation until the sound stops on its own. If the backup lights come on while the main power is still live, turn off your headlamp immediately and keep your eyes on the floor until the white lights cut out. If you lose radio signal in the last access tunnel, stop where you are. If the signal returns with someone already speaking, do not reply unless you are certain they used your full name. If you see wet boot prints coming out of the sump corridor after 1 a.m., do not follow them toward the main line. Lock the pump room, leave by the upper ladder, and do not turn around if you hear boots behind you. I read the whole thing once, then went back to the top and read it again slower, because the first pass had left me with the same feeling you get when somebody slips one wrong word into a sentence and you only notice after your brain has already tried to smooth it over. The rules didn't read like safety procedure. They read like instructions for a problem that shouldn't exist in a workplace at all. Normal mine rules tell you what not to touch, what to lock out, how long to ventilate, where not to stand, when to call it in. They are built around equipment failure, gas, water, unstable roof, human error. These weren't that. These sounded like the shape of an incident report somebody had stopped trying to explain. I looked back up at Doyle. He still hadn't moved. "You want to explain any of it?" I asked. Doyle shook his head once. "You won't need the explanation if you do it right." That answer irritated me more than the card did. I had the sudden strong feeling that I'd been dropped into the middle of something everybody else had already decided not to talk about in plain language. That happens in old operations. A workaround lasts long enough and eventually it hardens into custom. A man gets trained on a thing without being told where it started. Then, he trains the next guy the same way. After a while, the habit outlives the reason. I looked down at the card again. Rule 1 was the one that stuck out first. If pump 2 starts running before the panel shows a level rise, do not look into the sump. That part wasn't cautionary in the usual way. It wasn't, don't enter confined space or don't bypass lockout. It was, don't look. Then it told me to shut the outer gate, write down the time, and wait exactly 90 seconds. Exactly. Not around a minute and a half, not until the reading catches up. Exactly 90 seconds. Rule 2 bothered me even more. If you hear knocking from inside the discharge pipe, do not answer it. Not, do not investigate. Not check for line hammer. Answer it. That was the kind of wording that made me think either somebody had a sick sense of humor, or this card had been written by committee after too many late-night call-outs and not enough sleep. I should have laughed. I know that now. I should have told Doyle that if the pump station had gotten to the point where the paperwork sounded haunted, maybe somebody needed a vacation. But I didn't laugh, mostly because Doyle wasn't laughing and partly because men underground don't usually invent extra weirdness for themselves when a simple warning will do. They've already got enough to manage. My best guess at the time was that the card had started as some kind of internal protocol for the lower station when the readings got ugly. Maybe somebody had found that men made fewer dumb decisions if the instructions were blunt enough to cut through fatigue. Maybe don't look into the sump meant don't lean too far over the pit when the cycle starts. Maybe don't answer it meant don't start radio chatter over every random pipe noise in a bad signal area. If I worked at the explanations long enough, I could flatten most of the card into something halfway practical. Most of it. Rule 5 wouldn't flatten. Wet boot prints after 1 a.m. Lock the pump room. Use the upper ladder. Don't turn around if you hear boots behind you. There wasn't a clean workplace version of that one. Not one I could come up with standing there. Doyle shifted the clipboard under his arm and looked toward the intake tunnel like the conversation had already ended. "You hand that to everybody?" I asked. "Everybody covering lower Sump," he said. "How long's that been a thing?" "Long enough." That was all I got. I folded the card back along the old crease. For a second I thought about leaving it on the rack, not in some grand act of defiance, just because I don't like carrying nonsense in my shirt pocket while I work. But I didn't leave it. I slid it into the chest pocket anyway, buttoned the flap over it, and felt the stiff edge press against me when I moved. That was the part I've gone back to more than once. Not that Doyle gave me the rules. Not even that I read them. It's that I put them away carefully. Somewhere under the annoyance, under the eye-roll version of the whole thing I was trying to hold on to, some part of me had already decided the card belonged with the job. Then I picked up the log sheet, clipped my radio back into place, and headed for lower Sump. The last thing Jesse gave me before I went down wasn't really advice. It was a sentence he didn't want to explain. "Anything I should know before I head down?" I asked. Jesse kept his eyes on the coffee in his hand. "Do the checks. Don't freelance." That was Jesse in a nutshell. Half warning, half insult, delivered like he was talking about the weather. At the time, I took it the way I took most things underground. If a man didn't want to explain himself, you either pushed and made him stubborn, or you filed the sentence away and waited to learn why he'd said it. I filed that one away. The branch down to lower Sump peeled off the main line in a way that never felt dramatic until you were already in it. There wasn't some big threshold where the mine announced itself as different. It just narrowed by degrees. The roof came down a little. The walls crowded in. The track bed got rougher underfoot where water had worked on the floor for years and made the stone feel rounded in patches. The rib on my right stayed glossy black with moisture, and the beam from my lamp picked up thin runs of water threading their way down the rock face and disappearing behind brackets and conduit. The power cable run stayed with me most of the way down, fastened along the wall in clips that looked newer in some spots than others. Black cable, dull hardware, old anchor points filled and re-drilled where somebody had changed their mind years apart. There were mesh barriers in 2 places where the tunnel shouldered past older cut-throughs nobody used anymore. The mesh had the same look everything underground gets after enough time. Not abandoned exactly, just no longer part of anyone's daily thinking. Past the second barrier, the access split. Straight ahead was the lower approach to the pump room. Off to the side, bolted into the rock and rising along a narrower shaft, was the upper ladder route Doyle had mentioned on earlier jobs. It had a safety line, rust-flecked brackets, and the kind of angle that made it clear it was there for necessity, not convenience. By the time I reached the outer gate, the air had thickened enough that my shirt was sticking between my shoulder blades. The whole area smelled like wet steel, warm motor housings, and the mineral smell that comes off standing mine water when it's been left in the dark too long. Pump 2 was still running somewhere beyond the gate, and now that I was closer, I could feel it through the concrete before I saw the room itself. Not a heavy shake, more a low repeating thrum rising through the soles of my boots and into my knees. My radio cracked alive in my ear. "You down there yet?" Dana said over the radio. Dana Collier worked the control side on nights, and she had the kind of voice that made people think she was calmer than she probably felt. Tight, clear, no wasted syllables. Good voice for a radio, better than most of the men underground. "At the outer gate," I said. "Signal drops in the last tunnel. Don't let that spook you." "Wasn't planning on it," I said, though that wasn't really an answer. The line hissed once, then settled. I unhooked the gate, stepped through, and pulled it shut behind me out of habit. The latch caught, though not with the clean, hard seat I expected. I looked back and saw the gate sitting where it should have been, frame lined up, chain slack where it always hung, but the latch itself looked a hair off. Not open, not closed wrong, just not sitting all the way home. I gave it another push with my boot and heard the metal bite in a little deeper. Stuff like that happens underground. Hardware shifts, hinges drag, moisture gets into everything. That was the first rule of maintenance work. If a thing feels haunted, check whether it's just old. Lower Sump Station itself wasn't large. It was the kind of space built for function and then left alone unless the function failed. The control panel sat on one wall inside a steel housing with indicator lights, level readout, breaker handles, handwritten labels that had been updated over time, and a laminated schematic curled at one corner under the plastic cover. Beside it were the gauges and the level monitor. The discharge pipe ran out thick and industrial, bolted along the wall and out through the tunnel beyond, carrying pumped water up and away from the lower workings. The floor stayed slick with a thin spread of water that never fully disappeared, even when everything was working right. White mineral streaks fanned down parts of the wall where damp had dried and dried again over the years. There was a camera pointed toward the pit area, a utility light over the panel, and a second harsh white light farther back that always made the room look flatter than it was. The system itself wasn't complicated. Water collected in the sump pit at the lowest point. Sensors tracked the level. Pump 1 and Pump 2 alternated under normal conditions, so one motor didn't eat the whole workload. If the level came up wrong or one pump lagged, the other kicked in. There was a backup in place because water isn't a small problem underground. You don't ignore it and hope it gets tired. If it gets where it shouldn't, it takes the mine with it one room at a time. I set my tool bag down by the dry edge near the panel and started my checks the same way I always did, because routine matters more than people think. You don't let a room tell you what it is before you've looked at the boring parts first. I checked panel readings, breaker positions, indicator lights, current draw, the lag time against the level line. I held the back of my hand near one of the breakers to feel for abnormal heat before I put my fingers on anything directly. Nothing there felt cooked, no burn insulation smell, no hot metal note under the oil and damp. Pump 2 was still running, and the level monitor still wasn't showing the rise it should have if the cycle had triggered clean. That irritated me more the longer I stared at it. You can deal with a bad part. You can swap a sensor, isolate a line, reseat a relay. What you hate is inconsistency. Inconsistency is what eats time. It's what makes you feel stupid in front of a machine. I checked the radio condition next, clear enough in the room, thin at the doorway. That tracked with what Dana had said. I looked over at the monitor feed from the pit camera. The image had that milky interference I'd seen before in wet sections, the kind where the picture was technically there but kept blurring at the edges as if the lens had a breath on it. Moisture did that. Bad ground did that. Cheap older cameras definitely did that. None of it meant anything by itself. That was the thing about the whole place at first. Everything could still be explained. The pump sound was the first piece that kept bothering me. Up close, it still carried that off rhythm I'd noticed in the tunnel. Not enough to call it mechanical damage, more like the timing of a man knocking with a hand instead of a machine cycling through a load. I stood still and listened long enough to get annoyed with myself for listening. Then I bent near the panel again and wrote down the time, the current status, the mismatch between the pump cycle and the level reading. Something knocked once. I looked toward the discharge pipe without meaning to. The sound had been distant and hollow enough that I could have blamed the line itself. Water hammer, valve chatter, pressure settling somewhere farther down the run. I waited. Nothing. Just the steady mechanical thud of Pump 2 and the faint hiss of air movement through the tunnel behind me. I went back to work. I checked the edge seals around the panel housing, wiped moisture off the lip with a rag, looked at the cable entry points. One of the secondary lights reflected across the water on the floor and made a white band that moved when I moved, but not exactly the way I expected. It slid too far at first, then stopped. I looked up at the fixture and then back down, and the reflection lined up normally the second time. Angle, just angle. A wet floor will lie to you all night if you let it. I told myself that and almost believed it. Then I noticed the gate again, not the outer one behind me, the smaller one nearer the sump corridor. It had been pulled mostly shut already, and at a glance it looked fine, but the latch wasn't resting right there either. Same as the first gate, close enough to pass unless you were looking for clean alignment. I walked over, nudged it with 2 fingers, and felt it give a fraction before settling. That shouldn't have bothered me, but it did. 2 gates in one station, both seated almost right. I stood there listening. Somewhere inside the room, or beyond it, or inside the pipe itself, I heard another soft knock. Just one. Not loud, not dramatic. The kind of sound a man could work around all night if he wanted to. That was the problem. Everything down there was ordinary enough to keep touching, ordinary enough to keep explaining. The damp, the static, the gates that didn't sit quite right, the monitor feed going soft around the edges, the pump vibration in the floor, the smell of wet metal and standing water, the little sounds a place makes when it's too old and too wet and too far from everybody else. I trusted the room because it looked like a room I understood. I just couldn't relax in it. Not fully. Not with Pump 2 already running against the log in my pocket, and not with every small thing fitting reality just well enough to make me stay in place and keep checking. I stood in front of the panel and watched the level line hold steady while Pump 2 kept running like it had a reason I wasn't being told. The first thing I did was look at the indicator cluster again, then the level monitor, then the current draw, like the numbers might get embarrassed under a second glance and fix themselves. They didn't. The panel still said the water hadn't come up. The pump still sounded live. My instinct was to step closer to the sump corridor and put eyes on the pit. That was basic maintenance logic. If something starts out of sequence, you go look for the simple causes first. Trash in the intake, a float hanging wrong, mineral buildup on the sensor, a bad read off a damp contact. You don't stand there philosophizing about it. You get closer to the problem until it becomes a part or a line item. Then I remembered the card in my shirt pocket. If Pump 2 starts running before the panel shows a level rise, do not look into the sump. That line irritated me all over again. It didn't sound like procedure. It sounded like somebody trying to boss a grown man around with half a sentence and no reason attached. For maybe 2 seconds, I seriously considered ignoring it on principle. I was tired, annoyed, wet up to the knees, and standing in a room where every useful answer lived in the direction I'd just been told not to look. That was exactly why I didn't ignore it. I pulled the outer gate fully shut, checked the latch with my hand this time instead of my boot, and made sure it seated hard. Then I stepped back to the panel, took out the pen clipped inside my breast pocket, and logged the time. I looked at my watch and started counting out the 90 seconds in my head. It felt stupid immediately. That was another thing about underground work. If you do enough of it, routine can make anything feel reasonable. So sometimes the only way you can tell a situation is wrong is by how stupid the correct action feels while you're doing it. Standing there waiting because a folded card told me not to look into a sump pit while a pump ran ahead of its own readings felt stupid in exactly that way. I kept my eyes on the panel, on the current draw, on the level line that still hadn't moved. The sound of the pump shifted. Not a mechanical failure sound, not the hard, ugly chatter of a motor about to give up. It was subtler than that, which somehow made it worse. For a few seconds it sounded like it was pulling a normal load. Then it changed and went thinner, like it was running half dry. Then there came a brief pause, not long enough to count as an interruption, but long enough that every part of my body noticed it. The sound that followed wasn't louder. It was heavier, like whatever was below had resettled and the machine had found it again. I didn't like how quickly I gave that sound a shape in my head. 40 seconds. 50. 60. The room seemed to tighten around little things while I waited. Water ticked somewhere in the corridor beyond the pit. The utility light hummed faintly over the panel. My own breathing got louder than it should have been. I shifted my stance once and heard the sole of my boot peel off the wet concrete with a soft tack of sound that made me glance down before I could stop myself. The water on the floor caught the light in a dull white film. Nothing moved in it except the ripple from my own step. 75 seconds. The pump made that heavier sound again. Not a knock, not yet, just a change in load if you wanted to be generous. A mechanic could have called it turbulence. An electrician could have blamed lag and sloppy sensor timing. I wanted badly enough for both of those things to be true that I started rehearsing how I'd describe it later. Pump cycling ahead of level due to delayed sensor response, possible intermittent false start, need physical inspection. That was the language I trusted. That was the language that kept a shift from turning into a story. 89. At 90 seconds exactly, the level line on the panel jumped, not crept, not edged upward over 3 readings. It jumped, like the panel had finally decided to admit the water had been there the whole time. That was the moment my stomach dropped. If the level had risen slowly, I could have told myself the rule had just gotten lucky. If the panel had glitched harder, I could have blamed the monitor. But the clean delayed jump after the exact wait time on the card did something colder than fear. It took the rule out of the category of nonsense and put it into the category of things that work for reasons you don't understand yet. I stared at the line a second too long. My mouth had gone dry in a room wet enough to drip. Then, from somewhere to my left, I heard a faint hollow tap. I looked toward the discharge pipe. The sound might have been nothing. It was small enough that if I had been moving at the time, I probably would have missed it under the pump noise. One sharp little hit from inside the line, like a loose piece of metal settling or pressure knocking through a bend farther down the run. I stayed still and listened. Nothing. Then another one, lighter this time. Farther in, maybe. Or farther out. Hard to tell in a room built to throw sound back at you in the wrong order. I reached up for the radio without thinking and pressed the transmit. "Dana, pump 2 came on early," I said. Static clipped for a second. "How early?" Dana said over the radio. "Before the level moved. I heard paper shift on her end, or maybe a sleeve against a console." Then a pause. "Log it," she said, "and don't go leaning over that sump." I looked at the pipe again. The pump kept running. The level line held where it had landed. "You telling me Doyle handed you the same card?" I asked. Donna took a second before answering. "I'm telling you to log it." That answer landed about as well as Doyle's had. Same shape, same refusal to say the thing behind the thing. It bothered me more coming from Dana because she wasn't a man built out of clipped phrases and old mind habits. If she was choosing her words, then she was doing it on purpose. I wrote the delayed level rise down exactly the way it happened. Time pump active before indicated rise. Delay approximately 90 seconds. No visual confirmation. The words looked weak on paper. Not wrong, just smaller than the feeling of standing there had been. The practical part of my mind pushed back hard. Sensors lag, panels misread, wet conditions cause interference. Radio chatter in bad stretches gets weird because signal does weird things underground. The card could still be an ugly internal workaround for a known set of equipment issues. The timing could still be coincidence, wrapped in enough repetition to make tired men superstitious. That was what I told myself. Then, the discharge pipe gave one more hollow knock from somewhere inside it, patient as a fingertip against a wall, and I realized I was listening to the room in a different way now, not like a mechanic waiting for a fault to repeat. like a man who had just followed a ridiculous instruction and gotten exactly the result it promised. I still believed there had to be a technical explanation. I just no longer believed the rules were a joke. I kept working because that was still the cleanest thing available to me. Once you've admitted a room is making you uneasy, the next best move is to put your hands on ordinary tasks until either the room settles down or you catch it doing something that fits on paper. I checked the relay housing again, wiped the edge of the panel where moisture had started gathering in a line, followed one cable run with my light to where it disappeared behind the bracket near the wall. I crouched, stood, made notes, listened. Pump 2 kept cycling with that same faintly wrong rhythm, and every few seconds I found myself glancing back toward the discharge pipe without meaning to. The knocking came again. Still small at first. 2 scattered taps from somewhere inside the line, hollow and metallic enough that I could have called it water movement if I'd wanted to stay comfortable. I stood still and waited for a third. It didn't come right away. The pause stretched long enough that I almost bent back to the panel. Then I got 3 in a row. Not loud, not forceful. Just evenly spaced enough that my shoulders went tight before my brain had a chance to explain them. Tap, 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 then silence. The kind of silence that felt less like absence and more like somebody waiting to see what you were going to do with what you just heard. I looked down at the tool bag by my boots. My wrench was right there, half out of the side pocket. The flashlight in my hand had a steel cap on the end. If I'd been anywhere else, I probably would have wrapped the pipe back once just to hear how the sound traveled. That's what maintenance work does to you. It trains little responses into your body. You tap a panel to hear if the vibration changes. You knock a housing to tell whether something is loose inside. You answer sound with sound to learn what kind of sound it is. My wrist had already started moving before I remembered Rule 2. If you hear knocking from inside the discharge pipe, do not answer it, do not tap back, and do not radio for a second confirmation until the sound stops on its own. That wording got under my skin even more now than it had at the rack. Do not answer it. Like the card, understood the difference between a pipe making noise and something in the pipe trying to start a conversation. I kept the flashlight still at my side and waited. Tap, 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 same spacing, then nothing again. I keyed the radio with my thumb. Dana, you still reading me clean? A burst of static came first, then her voice, mostly. I'm getting some noise in the discharge line, I said. I made myself say it flat, like I was reporting vibration and not whatever my nerves wanted to call it. You seeing any pressure bounce on your end? There was a pause before she answered. What kind of noise? That was the first time her tone shifted enough for me to notice. Not dramatic, just tighter, more precise. Hard to tell, I said. Could be chatter. What exactly are you hearing? I looked at the pipe. The question was too direct in a way that made me feel stupid for not asking something else instead. A knock, I said. Inside the line. The radio hissed softly. Then Dana said, Don't get close to it. That made me smile once, but there wasn't any humor in it. That from the card, too? Dana didn't answer the question. Just stay where you can see the panel. That was becoming the pattern with everybody connected to Lower Sump. I'd ask one thing and get handed a sentence that only made sense if a second conversation had already happened somewhere without me in it. I let off the transmit key and stared at the pipe. For maybe 20 seconds it did nothing. Pump 2 kept running. Water on the floor trembled in a thin line where the vibration reached it. Somewhere behind the panel housing, I heard the small electric tick of a relay settling. Then the knocking came back. Tap. A pause. Tap. Tap. Not random anymore, not even close. It still could have been a mechanical issue if you looked at it from far enough away, but I wasn't far enough away. I was standing in the room with it, listening to how each sound arrived after a beat just a little too clean, a little too placed. I could feel the stupid urge to respond building in me again, not because I thought anything was literally in there, because something about the pattern had started pulling on the part of my brain that hates unfinished sequences. If it knocks, let it finish. Jesse had said that by the coffee station when I circled back past him for a battery clip I didn't actually need. I hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now it came back so clearly I could hear the scrape in his voice. I set the radio on the panel lip for a second, so both hands were free, and forced myself into another check. That was how I handled it. Relay first. Moisture seal, cable run, indicator light. If you keep checking ordinary things, sometimes a room starts making sense again. I wiped the edge of the panel again and followed the cable toward the secondary box, running 2 fingers along the jacket until they came back wet with condensation. I checked the breaker temperature with the back of my hand. Normal. I opened the side compartment enough to inspect the seating on one of the terminals, then closed it. Behind me, the pipe knocked again. This time it didn't stay in the pipe. That's the only way I know to say it. The first sound came from the metal, hollow and contained. The second came a little broader, as if it had hit the wall and spread through it before it reached me. By the third, I felt it under my boots more than I heard it. Not a stomp, not a real impact, just a contact traveling through the concrete and the wet beneath it, like the sound was no longer staying where it should have stayed. I straightened up slow. Pump 2 kept running. Tap, a pause, tap, tap. Only now, the last 2 came from different places. One from the discharge line, one from the floor near the base of the panel. Every small muscle in my back pulled tight at once. I picked up the radio and opened my mouth to call Dana again. The backup lights came on. They didn't flicker first. They just snapped to life over my head while the main power stayed on, flooding the room with a flat, cold white that erased all the softer shadows my headlamp had been making. For one stupid half-second, I started to look up. Pure reflex, the way anybody would when the lighting in a room changes without warning. Then, Rule 3 hit me all at once. If the backup lights come on while the main power is still live, turn off your headlamp immediately and keep your eyes on the floor until the white lights cut out. My thumb found the switch on my lamp so fast it almost hurt. Darkness vanished from the edges of my vision as soon as I killed it, leaving only that harsh white overhead glow and the floor at my feet. I kept my eyes down. That part sounds easy until you try it in a room where you already know something is wrong. Every nerve from the shoulders up wants to check the corners and the ceiling and the line of sight over your own head. Instead, I stared at the thin water spread over the concrete and watched the light tremble inside it. At first, all I saw were warped reflections. My boots, the lower edge of the panel, a bright wash from the ceiling fixtures, broken where water ran in threads around grit and old mineral dust. Then, the shapes above me shifted. I couldn't see them directly, only as stretched pieces in the film of water, vertical lines where no lines should have been, a break in the light that moved without matching my own movement. One reflection that looked like a set of legs until it split and became too many angles at once, then settled back into something my brain tried and failed to correct. I stayed where I was. My jaw had locked so hard I could feel it in my ears. The worst part wasn't seeing something impossible. It was not letting myself look up to prove to myself I was wrong. There's a point where following a rule stops feeling careful and starts feeling personal. Like obedience is the only thing standing between you and knowledge you'll never set back down clean. That was what the white light did to the room. It made ignorance feel like work. I don't know how long it lasted. It couldn't have been very long. 10 seconds maybe. 15. The lights cut out as abruptly as they'd come on, and the station dropped back into its normal dim utility lighting. I stood there another few beats with my headlamp still off, looking at the floor, until I trusted my hands enough to reach up and click it back on. When I finally did, the room looked like itself again. Panel, pipe, wet floor, white streaks on the wall, nothing hanging above me, nothing standing where the reflection said something had been. I swallowed hard and realized my tongue tasted like copper. I should have gone straight back up then, logged it, handed Doyle the card, told him whatever game they were playing with Lower Sump needed a new audience. Instead, I made the mistake men like me always make. I tried to confirm one more thing before I decided what kind of night I was having. There was a secondary box farther back off the access stretch, tied into a monitor and reset point that sometimes cleared delayed readings. If the signal lag and light event were both symptoms of a grounding issue, that box was as good a place as any to check next. It was practical. It was stupid. Those two things overlap more than people like to admit. I took the radio and headed back through the last access tunnel. The signal died halfway there. Not weak, not patchy, just gone. I stopped where I was so abruptly my boot slid on the damp stone. Rule 4 had been weird enough on paper that my body had remembered it in full. If you lose radio signal in the last access tunnel, stop where you are. If the signal returns with someone already speaking, do not reply unless you are certain they used your full name. So I stood there in the tight tunnel, with one hand on the wall, lamp beam pointed down the center, the radio dead and silent at my shoulder. Water ticked somewhere ahead. Pump noise reached me thin from back the way I'd come. The dark in front of me felt denser than the dark behind me, which didn't mean anything except that my brain had started sorting space into before and after. Then the radio came back mid-voice. "Hear me now?" I froze harder. It sounded like Dana. Maybe. The tunnel did bad things to voices even when the equipment was working, flattening them and stripping edges off. There was static under it, a soft bed of hiss, then again, clearer. Blaine. Not Blaine Cutter, just Blaine. I should have kept my mouth shut. That's the plain version. I knew the rule. I had the whole sentence in my head. I'd just watched a set of lights obey another one, like somebody was turning pages ahead of me. But hearing my own name in the dead stretch of tunnel did exactly what names are meant to do. It made me answer before the thought caught up. "Yeah?" I said. The word was barely out before I knew I'd done it. Static surged once, loud enough to sting my ear. Then there was silence again. I stood there listening to my own breathing, one hand still on the wall. A cold line of sweat slid from my temple down past my jaw and into my collar. I waited for Dana to come back and cuss me out for bad timing or tell me she'd been trying to raise me from the surface all along. Nothing came. I keyed the radio. "Dana, I lost you in the last tunnel," I said. Her answer came after a beat. "Then don't move when it goes dead," Dana said over the radio. "That your official advice?" "That's the only kind I'm giving you." Her voice sounded normal enough that I almost laughed from relief, but relief didn't stick. Something in the cadence was wrong by a fraction, or maybe I was already too wound up to hear her clean anymore. I asked for a level read anyway. She gave me numbers that mostly tracked with the panel lag I'd already seen. Helpful, but not enough. Not enough to explain the timing. Not enough to explain the lights. Not enough to explain why hearing my first name in the tunnel had made my chest lock up like I'd heard it from somewhere younger. I checked the secondary box, found nothing decisive, and came back toward the pump room with the feeling that I had crossed some line the room was waiting on. The first thing I saw when my lamp hit the threshold was water, where I knew I hadn't left any, not a flood, just prints. 3 partial wet boot marks leading away from the sump corridor at an angle no one should have been walking. They weren't clean enough to count as Rule 5 yet, not with the time still short of 1 o'clock, and not with the impressions broken by the damp already on the floor. But they were wrong. Too shaped to be splash, too placed to be runoff. I stopped short. One of the latches clicked. I watched it happen. The smaller gate near the sump corridor sat closed, then gave a little metallic twitch and opened itself 1 inch. maybe 2. Slow enough that the sound came before the movement fully registered. Just a tiny release of tension. A thing settling if you wanted to lie to yourself. I wanted to lie to myself very badly. So I took one careful step closer and checked the hinge line with my light. The latch hung loose. I know what I'd done. I know I'd pressed it fully shut earlier. I remember the feel of it under my fingers because at the time I'd been annoyed by how much attention I was paying to it. Now it sat there open by a fraction, like a mouth not sure whether it meant to speak. I looked back at the panel. The wrench I'd left beside the log sheet was no longer where I'd set it. Not far. Just turned a little, shifted half its length so the handle pointed toward the corridor instead of the panel face. The kind of change you could miss if you hadn't been working in small spaces long enough to know exactly where your hands leave things. Behind me, from farther up the tunnel than the pipe should have carried it, I heard a voice say my name again. Not loud, not quite Dana, not quite anything I could put my hand on. I didn't answer that time. I went back up the line as far as the service cutout and found Jesse leaning near the supply shelf, where the heat from the equipment room barely reached. He looked at my face once and set his cup down without asking what had happened. "You ever hear it knock?" I asked. Jesse rubbed at his jaw. "Once." "What did you do?" "Nothing," he said. "That's why I'm still here." I stared at him. He let the silence sit until it got mean. Then he said, "If it starts sounding like somebody you know, you stop answering." He didn't look at me when he said it. That was when I understood 2 things at the same time. First, Jesse knew exactly what the rules were for, even if he was never going to say it straight. Second, I had already gotten one of them wrong. And from that point on, whatever was under the sump wasn't trying the room anymore. It was trying me. I wish I could say what Jesse told me settled anything. It didn't. It just changed the shape of what I was afraid of. Up to that point, everything at Lower Sump had still belonged, at least partly, to the mine. Pumps, lights, dead radio stretches, wet floors, doors that didn't sit right. Even the knocking could still be filed under one of those ugly underground categories where bad sound and old hardware make each other worse. But once Jesse said it starts sounding like somebody you know, a line got drawn through the middle of the night. On one side was equipment, on the other side was me. I went back down anyway. That's the part I'm least proud of, and also the part I understand best. I'd already answered once in the last tunnel. I'd already given whatever was down there 1 bad inch of ground. Walking away at that point would have been the smart version of the story, but smart isn't always the same thing as possible. Not when a room has started leaning on the exact piece of your life you can't stand to have touched. Not when you need one clean explanation badly enough to start chasing it. The station looked almost normal when I stepped back through the outer gate. Pump 2 had cycled off. The panel had settled into numbers that made more sense. The smaller gate near the sump corridor was still sitting a little off, though now I couldn't have sworn whether it was more open than before, or whether I'd simply started measuring every angle in the room too hard. My wrench was still where it had shifted to, turned slightly wrong on the panel edge like a hand had set it down while thinking about something else. I left it there and listened. For a few seconds I heard nothing but the ordinary sounds again. Water ticking somewhere in the back, electrical hum, my own breath. Then, very soft from somewhere near the discharge line or maybe under the floor, I heard 3 quick taps. Not the space tapping from before, 3 fast ones. My whole body went cold so fast, it felt like somebody had poured creek water under my skin. It was the same pattern Micah used when he knocked on my apartment door. 3 quick taps, then my name if I didn't answer fast enough. He'd turned it into a game over the years. If he called while I was distracted and I took too long to answer, he'd tap the phone case the same way and say, "Dad, you there?" Not because it meant anything to anybody else, because it meant something to us. I stayed perfectly still and told myself there were only so many ways a knock could happen in a metal room. 3 quick taps did not belong to us. 3 quick taps belonged to math and coincidence and any number of things I was tired enough to mistake. I kept telling myself that even as every muscle in my back pulled tight enough to ache, the taps came again, 3 fast, then nothing. I looked down at the radio clipped to my belt like it might already be awake. It wasn't. I unclipped it anyway and keyed Dana. "You got anything trying to root through down here?" A burst of static, then her voice. "Nothing on my end." "Phone line either?" "Not to your channel." That should have helped. It didn't. I stood there looking at the dark rectangle of the radio speaker, waiting for it to stay a machine. Instead, Dana said, "There was a dropped call attempt a minute ago. Didn't carry long enough to flag clean." I pulled my phone out of my pocket on reflex and checked the screen. No missed call, no half ring, no service, same as always. Just the last message thread with Micah still sitting there when I unlocked it, his picture of that crooked volcano smiling up at me from a world that had nothing to do with where I was standing. My thumb hovered over his name, and I hated myself a little for how badly I wanted to hit call just to prove I still could. I locked the screen and shoved the phone away harder than I meant to. "Dana, if anybody patched a call through to my radio, I need to know now," I said. Donna didn't answer right away. "No one patched anything through." There are ways people tell the truth that make it sound like a lie anyway. That wasn't what this was. Dana sounded like somebody giving me the cleanest answer she had and knowing it wouldn't help. I moved farther into the station, one slow step at a time, lamp beam low. Angry by then, which surprised me less than it should have. Fear, I understood. Anger took a second, but once it got there, it made a nasty kind of sense. Whatever had been waiting under the sump had found the one thing in my life I was least built to hear down there and put its hands on it like it belonged to the room. That made me want to break every careful rule I'd followed just long enough to force the night back into a shape I recognized. That was the danger of it. Not that it scared me, that it made me want to stop being disciplined. I went back up the service stretch again, this time farther, until I found Harlan Pike in the older maintenance alcove off the side corridor, sitting on an overturned bucket with both hands around a paper cup that had long since stopped steaming. Harlan had been in and out of Black Hollow longer than most of the hardware. He wasn't on Lower Sump that night. He wasn't really on much of anything anymore except the kind of unofficial usefulness old men in mines develop when they've seen enough to stop pretending every problem belongs on a form. He looked at me once and didn't ask why my face had gone tight. "What is it doing?" I asked. Harlan stared at the floor drain for a second. "Using what gets you to answer." That landed in me hard because of how simple it was. Not using what scares you. Not using what hurts you, using what gets you to answer. Like the whole thing under Lower Sump wasn't a haunting so much as a method. I waited for more. Harlan didn't give it. After a while he said, "That section had a bad year a long time back. Water came where it shouldn't. Couple things after that didn't write up clean. Folks stopped trying to explain all of it." He rubbed one thumb against the rim of the cup. "Place keeps things." I didn't ask him to define that. I don't think he could have, even if he wanted to. When I headed back toward Lower Sump again, I was no longer doing a job in the ordinary sense. I was carrying the knowledge that something down there had stopped circling me and found the exact place to press. I was still checking panels, still watching readings, still pretending I could thread this back through logic if I was careful enough. But underneath all of that was a much uglier truth. I needed to know whether the voice would come back. That's what makes this section of the night hard to explain to people who've never had a place learn them in real time. Every rule, every practical thought, every mile of working man caution I had built up over years underground should have been enough to get me out of there. Instead, I stayed because part of me had turned into a father standing in the dark waiting to hear whether his son's voice would say his name again. And then it did. "Dad?" The voice came through the radio so clean it made my stomach drop. I didn't say anything. "Dad, where are you?" It wasn't close. It wasn't perfect. There was a thin wrongness under it, like a familiar song played through the wrong speaker. But it was Micah in every way that mattered to a man not thinking straight. The lift on the word "dad." The slight rush into the second sentence, the little uncertainty at the end, like he'd already decided I was late answering and was trying not to sound worried yet. My hand closed so hard around the radio it hurt. In that moment, Lower Sump stopped being a problem in a mine. It stopped being pumps and gates and dead signal and lights. It became a place that knew my son's voice. That was when I understood, fully and without any room left to argue with myself, that whatever was down there was no longer just copying noise. It had learned Micah. I don't know how long I stood there with the radio in my hand after I heard Micah's voice. Long enough for my arm to start trembling from holding it too tight. Long enough for the room to settle back into its ordinary sounds around something that wasn't ordinary anymore. Water. Electrical hum. Air moving through the tunnel. The low industrial breathing of a mine that keeps going whether you understand the part of it you're standing in or not. I hadn't answered that time, but I'd already answered once in the last access tunnel, and that was enough to keep replaying in my head like bad math. I had done exactly one thing the card told me not to do. I had responded when the signal came back wrong. If all the other rules had held so far, then the simplest ugly possibility was that the mistake mattered in the same plain mechanical way the others mattered, not superstition, sequence, cause and effect in a language I hated. I went back up the line and found Doyle near the equipment rack, signing off on something with his clipboard while the rest of the section carried on around him like the mine was still a place where men only worried about ordinary failures. "How long has this been going on?" I said. Doyle kept his eyes on the door. "Long enough for there to be rules." That answer would have made me angrier an hour earlier. By then I was too far past anger for it to help. I stood there looking at him, at the clipboard, at the pencil tucked behind one ear like this was all still shift work and paperwork, and not whatever I had just heard call me Dad from 200 feet under rock. I said, "The rules aren't for the pumps." Doyle looked at me once. No. That was it. No denial. No easing into the truth. Just no. Something about getting the answer clean like that did more to settle the night in my head than anything else had. It didn't make it better. It just took away the last excuse I'd been carrying around for why everybody sounded half careful, half tired whenever Lower Sump came up. Doyle wasn't protecting me from a story. He was protecting the shape of the rules themselves. Any extra explanation, any attempt to soften them or dress them up, would have turned them into something easier to argue with. I found Harlan again before I went back down. He was still in the side alcove, cup in hand, like old men in mines somehow know exactly when not to move. "What happens if somebody answers?" I asked. Harlan took his time. "It gets closer in the shape that works." I let that sit there because there wasn't anything useful to say after it. He looked at the floor, then at me, then back toward the tunnel that led down to Lower Sump. "It ain't in the water," he said after a while. "Not like folks want to think. Water's just where it learned to stay." He rubbed his thumb along the cup seam. "Pumps give it rhythm. Pipe gives it something to knock through. Light gives it edges. Dead spots on the radio give it room. Then it finds a voice." That was the first time anybody laid it out in terms that plain, and once he did, the whole night rearranged itself inside my head. The rules weren't mystical. They weren't there to ward anything off in the dramatic movie sense. They were procedural in the ugliest possible way. They were a refusal pattern. Don't look into the sump, because looking gives it a line. Don't tap back, because answering a pattern gives it another. Don't look up under the white lights, because reflected shape is enough for it to work with. Don't answer the wrong voice in the dead tunnel, because once it knows what gets a response, it keeps using it. don't turn around. That was the shape of it. Not magic, not folklore, a system of not giving something what it needs to become more exact. And I had already failed that system once. I went back down carrying that thought like weight in my ribs. Lower Sump felt different now, not because the room itself had changed, but because I had stopped mistaking the tools for the thing using them. The pumps were just pumps. The pipe was just pipe. The white light was only light. The radio dead zone was still a dead zone. None of those things were the threat by themselves. They were the surfaces it leaned on, the channels it could move through if a person on the other end behaved predictably enough. When I stepped back into the station, everything looked almost insultingly normal again. The panel readings made sense. Pump 2 had cycled down. Pump 1 sat idle and honest. The floor still held its thin coat of water. The discharge pipe ran along the wall with the same bolts and the same mineral staining. My wrench was still turned wrong on the panel edge, which now seemed less important than it had 10 minutes earlier, and more important than it had any right to be. I checked the time. A little after 1 a.m. The moment my eyes dropped from the watch to the floor, I saw them. Wet boot prints, not partial marks this time, not shapes I could explain away as splash or runoff or my own bad angle. Clear prints, heel and sole, leading out from the sump corridor in a line that did not belong to my steps and did not overlap with anything else in the room. Fresh enough that the water around them still held a darker outline before the concrete began drinking it in. I stopped so hard, my heel barked against the floor. One print, then another, all of them leading away from the corridor and angling toward the main line. Rule 5 became real in that instant, in a way the others hadn't quite managed until they were already happening. Maybe because boot prints are so ordinary, so human. You don't have to interpret them. Somebody was either walking there or something had learned exactly enough about walking to leave the memory of it behind. I didn't move. I didn't even breathe right for a second. The room stayed quiet except for the distant pump cycle farther back and the fine ticking of water off metal. My lamp beam held steady on the tracks, following them one by one as they crossed the wet floor. They were the wrong size to be Micah's, the wrong size to be mine, the wrong size to mean anything comforting. But they were still boot prints, which made them worse. A thing in the dark can stay abstract. A path on the floor is a decision. From somewhere beyond the smaller gate, low and almost conversational, the discharge pipe gave a single knock. I looked at the corridor and understood the whole design of the rules all at once. They were not there to fix Lower Sump. Lower Sump could stay broken. The mine could lose readings and eat static and run old pumps out of sequence all night. That wasn't the emergency. The emergency was giving whatever lived in that place enough response to follow. I had given it one answer already. Maybe only one word. Maybe that was all it needed. The prints went on toward the main line, glossy at the edges in the lamplight, and I knew with a kind of sick final clarity that the night had crossed into its last shape. The climax had started. The prints kept going toward the main line, dark and fresh on the concrete, and for one stupid second, I just stood there staring at them like the shape of a boot might tell me what kind of thing had made it. Then, Rule 5 came back into my head, word for word. If you see wet boot prints coming out of the sump corridor after 1 a.m., do not follow them toward the main line. Lock the pump room, leave by the upper ladder, and do not turn around if you hear boots behind you. That was the clearest any of the rules had ever felt, not because I suddenly understood more, because there was no room left to pretend it meant something else. The prints were there. The time was past 1 a.m. The corridor behind them was the corridor I had already spent too much of the night trying to explain. I moved. Not fast at first. Fast gets sloppy underground. Sloppy gets you dead in ways that don't need anything supernatural behind them. I stepped to the smaller gate, kept my lamp down, and reached for the latch with a hand that had gone damp inside the glove. The metal felt slick and cold. I pulled it shut harder than I meant to and heard it catch. Then I turned toward the pump room door and crossed the space in 6 quick steps, boots splashing through the thin water on the floor, careful not to put mine over the prints if I could help it. That was when I heard him. "Blaine!" The voice came from behind me, small and scared and wrong by half an inch. I froze with my hand on the pump room door handle. It wasn't Micah saying "Dad" first. That was what made it worse. It was the sound of something learning in real time which version of a voice reached me fastest. The word had his shape in it, and not his age. Too much air in the middle, too little at the end. Like whatever was speaking had practiced the tone, but not the breath underneath it. I locked the pump room door. The lock threw with a hard metal clack that sounded louder than anything else in the station. My hand shook on it afterward, not because I was weak, just because there are moments when your body understands the stakes before your mind is willing to say them out loud. Behind me, soft as if it were standing just beyond the reach of the light, the voice said, "Dad, wait." Every part of me wanted to turn. That's the truth of it. Not some noble fight, not a clean decision, just the oldest reflex a father has getting dragged across every other instinct I had left. If Micah had ever sounded afraid in a parking lot, in a grocery store, in the dark outside a ball field, I would have turned toward that sound before I even knew I was moving. That's what makes being a parent dangerous in certain very specific ways. Your body learns a route to panic that bypasses thinking. I made one final mistake. "Micah," I said, barely louder than breath. One word. Just enough to hear myself do it and hate it at the same time. Something shifted behind me in the wet, not a lunge, not a dramatic rush, a step, a clean, deliberate step that put weight on concrete and lifted again. I didn't turn. I don't know if that's because I was brave or because some deeper part of me had finally accepted that the rules were the only reason I still had a body to argue with. I just kept moving. The upper ladder access was narrow and mean, set off the side of the chamber where the wall pinched in and the rock sweated harder. I hit it with my shoulder, found the first rung with my boot, and started climbing. Steel ladders in a mine have their own language. Every rung tells on you. The metal carries your weight forward and down into the rock, and anything else on it comes back through your hands before your ears know what they're hearing. By the 3rd rung, I knew I wasn't alone on it. A boot hit below me, then another. Not scrambling, not chasing, just keeping pace in a rhythm too steady to belong to panic. I climbed faster anyway. Water dripped from somewhere overhead onto the back of my neck and ran cold under my collar. The safety line rattled against the brackets. My lamp beam shook across the steel and the rough shaft wall, making everything look closer than it was. Below me, one more step, then another, and in between those steps, breathing. That was the part I still wake up with sometimes, not footsteps, breathing. Or something that wanted to sound like breathing and hadn't gotten all the way there yet. For a second it sounded the right age, then it didn't. Too slow, then too quick, then a wet catch in the throat that no living kid of mine had ever made, like it was learning him as it climbed. I kept my eyes on the rung in front of my face. My forearm started burning halfway up. My right knee slipped once and barked hard against steel, and for one blind flash I thought that was it, that I'd turn without meaning to just from the jolt of it. I didn't. I hauled myself up, boot found the next rung and the next. "Dad?" It came from below and behind me, closer now, not louder, closer. There's a difference. Loud still lets you believe in distance. Close is something your body measures in the back of the neck. I climbed, another boot fall, another. Then the shaft opened out above me into the upper line access, where the light was warmer and uglier and real in the only way that mattered to me then. I got one arm over the lip, dragged myself up onto the graded landing, rolled hard to one side, and came up facing the tunnel without looking back down the ladder throat. There were men up there, 2 mechanics from another section, a roof guy I knew by face better than name. Somebody saying something sharp I didn't catch, because all the blood in my head was still beating around the sound of steel rungs and wet steps. The upper line light flattened everything into ordinary shapes again. Boots, hands, helmets, real people. No one else looked down the ladder right away, and I didn't tell them to. I just sat there with one hand still locked around the radio and the other gripping the grate until the muscles in my fingers started cramping. Whatever had been on the ladder didn't come up after me, or if it did, it knew better than to do it where the mine was full of witnesses and working light. The rest of the night got turned into paperwork the way bad nights always do. That was its own kind of insult. Statements, logs, times that didn't match clean because nothing down there had stayed in the right order long enough for a decent report. The lower pump room got sealed off before dawn under the excuse of electrical review and access restriction. Pump data was pulled. Camera feed was checked. Of course, the camera feed around the useful parts was garbage. Of course, the audio on the tunnel stretch where my signal died came back patchy and thin enough to argue over. Of course, nobody official wrote down that anything had spoken. Doyle asked me questions in the dry, clipped way. Foremen ask questions when they already know which answers won't survive a report. At one point, while I was sitting on an overturned crate near the service bay, with mud drying on my boots and a paper cup going cold in my hands, he looked at me and said, "You made it up?" "Yeah," I said. He looked at the wet prints drying on my boots and didn't say anything else. That was the nearest anybody came to telling the truth before sunrise. I wasn't fired in some big dramatic scene. Mines don't work like that. They thin you out. They stop calling. They move your name off one schedule and forget to move it onto the next. Maybe I quit first. Maybe they helped me make it easy. By the end of that week, I was done with Black Hollow either way, and nobody argued hard enough to keep me. I lived after that, which sounds more complete than it was. I got a small rental with thin walls and plumbing I could hear too clearly at night. I found work where I could, day jobs when possible, outdoor stuff if I had the option. I stopped carrying a radio unless I absolutely had to. I stopped going anywhere with pump noise if I could avoid it. Basement utility rooms made me sweat. The clank inside old pipes when heat kicked on could ruin the rest of an evening for me. I still saw Micah, but never the same way. No overnights for a while, then no evenings indoors. I made excuses that sounded normal enough to an adult and probably strange as hell to a kid. Parks, ball fields, parking lots outside burger places, daytime only. If it had walls and plumbing and shadows that held sound too long, I found a reason to keep us moving. He noticed, of course. Kids always do. He asked less than he could have, which somehow hurt more. He'd call sometimes in the evening and I'd let it ring twice before answering, just to prove to myself the sound was still his when it came through the phone. That's not something I'm proud of either. A few weeks later, just before 1 a.m., I was in the rental kitchen with the sink light on and everything else dark when I heard 3 fast taps from inside the wall behind the stove. I stood there holding a glass of water I hadn't taken a drink from yet. The apartment stayed quiet after that. No fans, no traffic close by. Just the hum of the refrigerator and the small electric buzz from the light over the sink. Then my phone lit up on the counter. No ringtone, no vibration. Just the screen coming awake all by itself, throwing a pale square across the laminate. From the end of the hallway, very soft, I heard a voice say, "Dad?" Micah wasn't there that night. I didn't answer.